I'm calling this video series The Evolution of the Afterlife because the Bible goes through three separate stages when it comes to answering the question, what happens to us after we die? Stage 1 is in 37 out of the 39 Old Testament books, where there's either no mention of an afterlife or we find passages that even specify that there's no such thing, that from dust we were created and to dust we shall return. Now the secular explanation for this is that the people who wrote the Old Testament passages, they just didn't believe in an afterlife. Either the thought of life after death had never occurred to them, or if it had occurred to them, they made a point of specifically denying it. Now, Christian apologists have a different explanation for the Old Testament passages that seem to deny an afterlife, but I'll get to that in that interpretation in parts 3 and 4 of this video series. All right, now we find stage 2 in 2 out of the 39 Old Testament books, in the books of Isaiah and Daniel, which are among the last to be added to the Hebrew Bible. And both of these books contain isolated and fleeting passages that apparently contradict the earlier Old Testament passages. For these books say that, well, there is an afterlife, or at least 2 sentences say that there's an afterlife. Now, the secular explanation for this switch is that by the time these books were written, the Israelites had been more exposed to other religions that had afterlife beliefs. And it's likely that this afterlife, the whole idea appealed to them more than their own "to dust thou shalt return" doctrine. All right, stage 3 we find in the New Testament, where we find that life after death is brought front and center stage, complete with Judgment Day and heaven and hell. And the afterlife also becomes one of Christianity's main selling points. That is the promise of an eternally wonderful afterlife if you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, or the threat of an eternally horrible one if you don't take Jesus up on the offer. Now, the secular explanation is because we find strikingly similar beliefs about Judgment Day and heaven and hell in the religious stories from the Greeks and the Zoroastrians and the Egyptians and others that likewise predate Christianity by centuries. It's only natural to conclude that the New Testament authors were influenced by these pre-existing religions. Now, many Christian apologists will acknowledge that the Bible has these 3 different stages, but apologists will also be able to explain why it's completely logical and that there's nothing contradictory about it. And again, I'll get to the Christian interpretation in parts 3 and 4. Now, as for my sources for the secular explanation, I'm going to start with the Bible itself. For if you look at the Bible's accounts of conversations with Adam and Eve, or with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, or Moses, you'll never hear God say anything like, "Obey me and I'll reward you in heaven," or "Disobey me and I'll punish you in hell." In most of the Old Testament, the character calls God says his justice is given out solely while here on earth. For the obedient, God rewards them with rain, with good crops, lots of children, military victories. For the disobedient, God punishes with drought, with famine, with plague, military defeat, and slavery. And also, God sends wild animals to kill the children, to eat the children of the disobedient. This is from Leviticus 26. "If you obey all my commandments, I will give you regular rain, and the land will yield bumper crops, and the trees will be loaded with fruit long after the normal time. You shall eat your fill and live safely in the land. For I will give you peace, and you will go to sleep without fear. You will chase your enemies, they will die beneath your swords. I will look after you and multiply you, and fulfill my covenant with you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. But if you reject my laws, this is what I will do to you. I will punish you with sudden terrors and panic, with tuberculosis and burning fever, and your eyes shall be consumed, and your life shall ebb away. You will sow your crops in vain, for your enemies will eat them. I will set my face against you, and you will flee before your attackers. Those who hate you will rule you. I will send wild animals to kill your children." Now, even though God refers to rewards and punishments as being strictly earthly matters, there are 3 brief mentions of humans who do have an afterlife. Elijah does in 2 Kings 2, verse 1, Enoch does in Genesis 5, verse 24, and Samuel in chapter 28 of 1 Samuel. But these are all pretty much stray, isolated passages. There's no explanation about what makes these 3 guys more special or more qualified than any of the more major Old Testament characters, like Abraham or Isaac or Joseph or Moses. So these 3 guys, they're apparently the only ones, because for everyone else, again, except for those couple sentences in Isaiah and Daniel, which I'll get to in part 2, the Old Testament tells us our bodily deaths are the absolute end of life. From Psalm 78, verses 38 and 39, "Time after time God restrained his anger and did not stir up his full wrath. He remembered that humans were but flesh, a passing breeze that does not return." Or as the famous passage from Genesis chapter 3, verse 19 puts it, "For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return." All right, now, in fact, some passages even argue against this whole idea of life after death. Solomon, for example, writes that those who claim to have knowledge of an afterlife have no proof. Here's what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 19 through 21. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over the animals. For all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? Now, it actually surprises me that the Bible's editors left this passage in. I mean, here we have a biblical passage that acknowledges that some people believe in afterlife, but this is all wishful thinking. This is just vanity. That when we die, no one can say that we're different from any other animal. And again, that's from Solomon, who's also known as one of the Bible's wisest men. Now, in part two, I'm going to move on to stage 2 of the Bible's evolution of the afterlife, which is where we find a few Old Testament passages that say, well, there is an afterlife.